The dead king moves into the machine feet first, wrapped in linen darkened by more than 3,000 years. Around him there is no palace, no incense, no bronze weapon raised in a hidden corridor. There is only the pale light of a modern scanning room, and a body that has survived tomb robbers, reburial, discovery, and the curiosity of the living. Ramesses III, once praised as the defender of Egypt, lies motionless beneath the circular frame of a CT scanner. As the table advances, the machine begins to peel away what the eye cannot see. Bandages dissolve into layers of digital shadow. Bone emerges. Soft tissue appears in ghostly cross-section. The face of a pharaoh becomes anatomy. Then, below the larynx, a wound opens on the screen. It is not a small cut, not damage caused by careless embalmers, and not a crack produced by centuries of drying. The injury plunges roughly 70 millimeters into the neck, cutting through the trachea and esophagus toward the cervical vertebrae. Major blood vessels in the region were severed. The wound is so extensive that survival for more than a very short time would have been virtually impossible. For generations, historians had read of a royal conspiracy and wondered whether it failed, whether Ramesses survived long enough to command the punishment of his enemies, or whether the official record had concealed a successful assassination. The scan does not reveal the hand that held the blade. It does not provide a room, an hour, or the exact sequence of the attack. But it establishes something the surviving texts never say: plainly the king died by violence. The discovery is unnerving because the wound had been hidden so effectively. When the mummy was examined after its recovery from the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, the neck appeared protected by unusually thick wrappings. Earlier investigators could see the aged skin and careful work of the embalmers, but not beneath the linen without damaging the body. The fatal opening remained sealed inside a ritual reconstruction. Modern imaging finally reached it without unwrapping a single layer. What appeared to be preservation was also concealment, though scholars still debate whether concealment was ever the embalmer's political intention. Their primary task was religious and physical: restore the damaged king, make his body whole, and prepare him for eternal existence. Inside the wound they placed a small amulet shaped as the Wedjat, the restored eye of Horus. In Egyptian belief, the eye represented healing after violence, order after dismemberment, and completeness recovered from ruin. Its location is almost painfully exact. The embalmers did not merely cover the injury, they acknowledged it through ritual, inserting an object of regeneration where the king's living body had been destroyed. The thick collar of linen around the throat may have supported the damaged tissues and recreated the proper outline of the neck. To the people performing the burial rites, death was not the final condition of the body. Damage could be corrected symbolically. Missing integrity could be supplied. A mortal wound could be transformed into a passage toward renewed life. Yet the CT image forces a colder reading. Someone came close enough to the ruler of Egypt to draw a sharp-edged weapon across or into his throat with force. This was no battlefield injury. Ramesses III was not killed by an arrow fired from beyond a shield wall or by a chariot accident on a military campaign. The wound belongs to proximity. It implies access, surprise, restraint, confusion, or some combination of them. It suggests that the barriers surrounding a divine king had failed at an intimate level. Guards, officials, doors, schedules, and layers of rank had not kept violence away. The man presented in temple reliefs as larger than his enemies, towering over foreign captives beneath the protection of the gods. had become vulnerable within his own world. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the wound on the scan is only the first opening. Beyond it lies a network of royal wives, servants, scribes, officers, messengers, magicians, judges, and princes, preserved in documents that seem precise until they are examined closely. Those texts describe treason but rarely speak plainly. They condemn criminals while avoiding the blunt statement that the king was murdered. They record spells, wax figures, messages, and plans to stir unrest beyond the palace. They preserve a prince under a name that may not have been his own. And they present royal justice as orderly, even though the case itself reveals a government shaken by betrayal. The contrast between body and papyrus lies at the mystery's heart. The body is brutally physical, tissue is cut, bone lies near the path of the blade, an amulet fills the space of injury. The papyrus is political. It selects, arranges, condemns, and obscures. One source shows what was done to the king, the other shows how the surviving state wanted the conspiracy remembered. Neither stands alone. The mummy cannot name conspirators, the judicial record cannot independently prove every wound, every motive, or every event surrounding the death. Together they create a convergence, one in which ancient propaganda and modern forensic science illuminate each other without fitting perfectly. Even the date of the killing refuses to settle into certainty. Administrative records place the accession of Ramesses IV on the 15th day of the 3rd month of Shimu, while workers at Deir el-Medina were informed of Ramesses III's death on the following day. Converting those civil dates into a precise modern date depends on disputed chronological models. Nothing surviving tells us whether the attack happened at midnight, at dawn, during a ceremony, or in a private chamber. The title of A Final Night captures the darkness and secrecy surrounding the event, but it remains a dramatic frame rather than a recovered fact. What survives in the record suggests a compressed passage from living king to dead king, from conspiracy to succession, and from violence to official control. So the last hours must be approached carefully. They cannot be reconstructed as a solved crime scene. There are no eyewitness statements in the modern sense, no preserved floor plan marked with blood, no weapon identified beyond doubt. There is instead a severed throat hidden beneath linen, a damaged royal body repaired for eternity, and a government document that circles around the central fact. Somewhere behind those fragments, Ramesses III passes from ruler to victim. The scanner reveals the ending before the story reveals how Egypt reached it. To understand who could breach the world around him, the view must widen from the wound to the kingdom he ruled, a kingdom still capable of magnificent victory, yet already straining under pressures that its monuments preferred not to show. The wound in the king's throat belongs to the final moment of a much longer strain. To see how a ruler who had spent decades presenting himself as Egypt's shield could die within reach of conspirators, it is necessary to step back into the world he governed. Ramesses III came to the throne in the early 12th century BCE, when the eastern Mediterranean was convulsed by disruption. Trade routes faltered, cities burned, dynasties vanished, and migrating groups crossed coastlines weakened by war, famine, and political collapse. Egypt did not escape this turmoil, but under Ramesses III it resisted forces that overwhelmed many of its neighbours without fully escaping the crisis. His reign is commonly placed around 1186 to 1155 BCE, though ancient chronology is never as exact as a modern calendar makes it appear. He is often described as the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, a phrase useful only if handled carefully. It means that Ramesses III was the last king of the period to project military power on a monumental scale, sponsor vast building programs, and claim victories in the language of universal kingship. His monuments deliberately compare him with Ramesses II, whose long reign had become a model of royal greatness. At Medinet Habu, Ramesses III built a mortuary temple that still dominates Western Thebes. Its walls do not speak in the hesitant language of a kingdom under pressure. They show a ruler favoured by the gods, defeating enemies, restoring order, and protecting Egypt from chaos. In one famous series of scenes, foreign warriors and ships are caught in battle as Egyptian archers fire from shore and enemy vessels collapse into confusion. These are among the best-known images associated with the groups modern scholarship calls the Sea Peoples. The inscriptions list several peoples, and scholars still debate their origins, movements, and relationships to the wider collapse of late Bronze Age states. What survives in the record suggests that Ramesses III faced at least two major external threats. Libyan groups pressed against Egypt's western approaches, while maritime and land forces from the north and east threatened the Nile Delta. The king's inscriptions claim decisive victories. Egypt appears to have prevented the kind of political destruction seen elsewhere, and that achievement was real enough to sustain royal authority. Yet the temple reliefs were never neutral reporting. Their purpose was theological as much as historical. The pharaoh defeats disorder because that is what a legitimate pharaoh must do. Captives, weapons, severed hands, and enemy ships become part of a visual argument the world remains stable because the king stands between Egypt and chaos. The Great Harris Papyrus extends that argument in another form. Compiled under Ramesses III after his father's death, it presents Ramesses III as a benefactor of temples, a victorious ruler, and a guardian of the land. It is also a work of dynastic memory. Its lists of donations and accomplishments help legitimize the successor. The murdered king is transformed into the ideal predecessor, and the transition becomes orderly on papyrus even if it had been violent in reality. The document says much about how the new reign wanted the old one remembered. It says almost nothing about the blade that ended it. Behind this polished image, the machinery of the state was showing signs of stress. One of the clearest glimpses comes from Deir el-Medina, the settlement of skilled workers who cut and decorated royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These labourers were specialists supported by state rations, and their records survive in unusual detail. During the reign of Ramesses III, deliveries of grain were delayed. The workers stopped work and gathered in protest, producing what is often called the first recorded labour strike in history. Their complaint was direct: they were hungry, and the rations owed to them had not arrived. The event is surprising because it occurred within a system devoted to royal burial. The men preparing the king's eternal monument abandoned their tools because the administration could not reliably feed them. Officials negotiated, promises were made, and some rations were delivered. But the episode exposes a gap between monumental power and administrative performance. Egypt could still carve walls proclaiming cosmic victory, while workers near the royal necropolis waited for grain. No single explanation fully accounts for the shortages, corruption, transport failures, changing economic conditions, pressure on resources, and institutional weakness may all have contributed. It would be tempting to turn these difficulties into a simple cause of the Harem conspiracy. A troubled economy creates resentment. Resentment produces rebellion. Rebellion reaches the palace. The evidence does not allow such a clean chain. The judicial texts do not say that delayed wages or grain shortages drove the accused prince, or their allies. Nor do the surviving records prove that military expenses or foreign wars directly caused the plot. Economic strain belongs to the background, not to a demonstrated motive. It matters because it shows that the state surrounding the aging king was less secure than his monuments claimed. But it cannot explain why members of the royal household sought to replace him. Ramesses III's authority therefore rested on two realities at once. In the first, he was the victorious king who preserved Egypt while other powers fell. In the second, his officials struggled with payment, supplies, corruption, and competing interests. These realities were not mutually exclusive. States can win wars and still weaken internally. A ruler can be genuinely successful and still become isolated by the system that celebrates him. The more perfect the royal image becomes, the harder it is to see the fractures behind it. By the later years of the reign, Ramesses III had ruled for decades. He had sons from more than one royal wife, a designated successor, and a court filled with people whose futures depended on access to the throne. Every appointment, marriage, household office, and line of descent carried political weight. The king's age made succession more urgent, while the scale of the royal establishment created channels through which influence could move. The fatal wound revealed that someone had crossed the last physical barrier. The pressures of the reign reveal something equally important long before the blade reached his throat. The world around Ramesses III had become crowded with uncertainty. That uncertainty did not make murder inevitable. It did, however, create a setting in which claims of order could hide competition, and loyalty could coexist with fear of the future. To understand how such competition became organized, the familiar image of the harem must be abandoned. It was not merely a secluded pleasure palace. It was a dynastic institution, an economic network, a residence, a ritual community, and a place where the question of who would inherit Egypt could quietly become a struggle over who controlled its next king. The struggle that formed around Ramesses III cannot be understood if the royal harem is imagined as a private chamber filled only with wives, luxury, and secrecy. That image belongs to later fantasies rather than pharaonic reality. The royal harem was a complex organization. It could include residences for queens and royal children, places of education, ritual spaces, workshops, agricultural estates, storerooms, herds, servants, scribes, guards, musicians, administrators, and officials whose responsibilities connected the household to the wider state. It was intimate because it surrounded the king's family, but it was also bureaucratic, economic, and political. The Egyptian term usually translated as harem referred to an enclosed or protected institution, not simply to a collection of women. Its precise form changed across periods and locations, and scholars still debate how particular buildings and titles should be interpreted. What survives in the record suggests several overlapping functions. Royal wives and children lived within its orbit. Princes and princesses could be raised and educated there, sometimes alongside children from elite families whose presence strengthened ties between the throne and powerful households. Religious ceremonies, music, textile production, food supply, and estate management could fall within the same institutional network. This matters because access to the royal family was never merely domestic. A nurse, steward, scribe, doorkeeper, guard, or administrator might occupy a position that appeared humble beside the grandeur of kingship. Yet such people controlled movement, messages, supplies, and information. They knew routines. They knew which corridors were guarded, which officials could be trusted, and which members of the royal family feared being excluded from the succession. A conspiracy did not need to begin in a council chamber. It could grow through a chain of ordinary duties performed by people who stood close enough to observe the machinery of power from within. The harem also had resources. Estates and workshops supported its inhabitants, while records, rations, and personnel linked it to other branches of administration. This made it less like a sealed room and more like a network with many points of contact. Messages could pass outward through servants or officials. Goods moved in and out. Soldiers and guards provided security, but they also created another human link between the royal household and the military. The institution's protective enclosure therefore contained a contradiction. The same system designed to guard royal women and heirs also gathered together many of the people who could help bypass that protection. At Medinet Habu, the monumental environment associated with Ramesses III offers a possible setting for imagining this world. Though caution is essential, the complex was not simply a temple in the modern sense. It combined ritual, commemorative, administrative, and defensive functions. Its eastern high gate included decorated rooms connected with royal women and ceremonial imagery. These spaces have often encouraged reconstructions of palace life and harem activity, yet archaeology does not identify them as the proven scene of the assassination. They show how royal, ritual, and residential functions could overlap. They do not provide a marked location where the king was attacked. Within such a setting, hierarchy would have shaped every interaction. Not all royal wives held the same standing, and not every son possessed the same chance of becoming king. Titles could express honor, office, or proximity to the ruler, but they do not always allow modern historians to reconstruct a precise ranking. Tie, the woman later associated with the conspiracy, was a wife of Ramesses III and the mother of the accused prince. Describing her simply as a low-ranking concubine goes beyond the evidence. Her exact status remains debated, but her ability to participate in a network of palace officials suggests that she was not politically insignificant. Royal motherhood carried its own form of power. A woman whose son became pharaoh could become central to the new reign, while the mother of an unsuccessful prince risked marginalization when succession was settled. The stakes were therefore dynastic rather than romantic. The harem conspiracy was not a jealous drama among secluded women. It concerned the transfer of sovereignty, the future of offices, and the survival of factions whose fortunes depended on one branch of the royal family defeating another. Behind the personal relationships lay control of Egypt's throne. The institution also helped shape princes long before succession became urgent. Royal sons were not raised in isolation from politics. Their education prepared them for military, religious, or administrative roles, and their companions might later become officers or courtiers. A prince who did not inherit could still command influence, but the difference between proximity to the throne and possession of it was immense. When an aging king had many sons, the household became a landscape of expectation. Some ambitions may have been encouraged, others were probably suppressed. The evidence remains incomplete, and the surviving judicial record tells the story only after one faction had lost. Women within the harem were similarly more than passive figures. They participated in ritual life, managed households, held titles, and maintained kinship connections. Some could communicate beyond the enclosed institution through relatives, servants, and administrators. The conspiracy texts mention women, but the official record often leaves them unnamed or compresses their roles into formulaic accusations. This silence is revealing. The state that preserved the case was interested in condemnation, not in providing a balanced account of every participant's motives. The word harem can therefore mislead before the story has even begun. It invites images of indulgence when the more accurate picture is one of organized proximity to power. It was a place where family, administration, religion, labor, and security met. That mixture made it essential to the functioning of the monarchy and dangerous when loyalty fractured. A plot form there could reach guards, scribes, military personnel, and people outside the palace without ever ceasing to be a household conspiracy. Seen from this angle, the assassination of Ramesses III no longer appears as an impossible breach from the outside. The threat was already embedded within the institution meant to preserve the dynasty. The conspirators did not have to penetrate an unknown world. Some of them lived and worked inside it. They understood its rhythms because they helped sustain them. They knew that kingship depended not only on divine claims and battlefield victories, but on doors being opened, orders being copied, guards remaining loyal, and messages reaching the right hands. The fatal wound beneath the linen began with that quieter vulnerability. Before a blade could reach the king's neck, trust had to fail across a chain of people. Before magic could be prepared or unrest encouraged, someone had to believe that another heir could replace the chosen successor. At the center of this emerging struggle stood Tia and a prince remembered under a suspicious name, surrounded by an institution powerful enough to nurture a dynasty and, under the right pressures, to threaten one. The danger inside the royal household became sharper as Ramesses III grew older, because every year made succession less theoretical. Egypt did not operate under a simple rule in which the eldest surviving son automatically inherited. A king could have several sons by different wives, and status, appointment, political support, and the ruler's choice all shape the path toward the throne. Some princes died before their father, others received military or religious offices. One was eventually recognized as the heir who would become Ramesses IV. Yet another branch of the family, centered on Tia and her son, appears to have rejected that outcome. The surviving documents do not provide a private account of Tia's thoughts. They preserve no letter in which she explains her motives, nor do they tell us when dissatisfaction hardened into conspiracy. What they show is the state's accusation that she sought to place her son upon the throne. That goal made the plot more than an attempt to remove a king. It was a competing succession plan. Ramesses III's death would create the opening, but the conspirators also had to prevent the designated heir and his supporters from controlling the transition. Tia is often described in popular retellings as a minor concubine consumed by ambition. That portrait is more confident than the evidence permits. She was a wife of Ramesses III and the mother of a royal son. Her exact rank within the household remains uncertain, and scholars still debate how the titles and family relationships of the period should be reconstructed. Whatever her formal position, the judicial record places her near the center of a movement capable of involving palace staff, administrators, soldiers, and outside contacts. She cannot be reduced to an ornamental figure suddenly seized by jealousy. Her son is even harder to recover. Modern histories usually call him Pentaware, but the judicial papyrus indicates that the condemned prince had previously borne another name, The name preserved in the proceedings may therefore be a deliberate replacement, distortion, or punitive label. Egyptian names carried meaning and identity. To alter a person's name in an official record could do more than protect the dignity of the royal house. It could attack memory itself, separating the condemned man from the name by which he had once been known and weakening his place among the remembered dead. This possibility fits a wider Egyptian concern with the survival of the name. Tomb inscriptions, statues, offerings, and spoken remembrance helped preserve a person's existence beyond death. Erasure could become a form of punishment. Names were removed from monuments, images were damaged, and enemies could be described through hostile expressions rather than honoured identities. Yet caution remains necessary. The papyrus does not explain every naming choice, and no single interpretation fully accounts for all the altered or unfavourable names attached to defendants. Pentawere may be a replacement name, a hostile rendering, or a conventional designation produced by the judicial process. It should not be treated unquestioningly as the prince's birth name. The prince's original standing is also obscure. He was close enough to the royal line to serve as the focus of a succession bid. But the texts do not provide a complete biography. They do not tell us what offices he held, how widely he was supported, or whether he designed the conspiracy attributed to his faction. The account presents him as guilty, but it was written after the attempt had failed, and by a government whose legitimacy depended on Ramesses IV's accession. That does not make the accusation false. It means the evidence comes through the voice of the victors. The designated successor had advantages. He appears to have been established as crown prince before the crisis, and may already have possessed administrative experience and loyal personnel. Succession required speed. Once an old king died, the new ruler's name had to enter official documents, commands had to be issued, burial arrangements had to proceed, and institutions throughout Egypt had to recognize the transfer. A rival claimant could not simply wait for public opinion. His faction would need to control access, communication, and perhaps military force, while royal authority was being reconstituted around a new body. This helps explain why a palace conspiracy could extend far beyond murder. Killing Ramesses III, even if successful, would not automatically make T's son Pharaoh. The chosen heir remained alive. Officials could proclaim him, priests could support him, and the state's scribal apparatus could begin dating records to his reign. The conspirators therefore needed an alternative structure of obedience. They needed people willing to carry messages, neutralize guards, influence soldiers, and create enough disruption outside the household to prevent the expected succession from settling into place. The scale of the intended upheaval remains uncertain. The judicial material suggests efforts to communicate beyond the harem and encourage opposition, perhaps even popular disturbance. It is difficult to know whether this represented a developed revolutionary plan or the official exaggeration of treason after the fact. Egyptian royal texts often expanded rebellion into an assault on cosmic order. Still, the range of accused participants shows that the conflict was not confined to a private quarrel. The throne was the center of government, religion, and military command. Contesting its inheritance meant contesting the structure that held those systems together. Ramesses III's many sons made the dynasty appear secure, but abundance could create rivalry as easily as continuity. Each prince belonged to a maternal household, a circle of attendants, and a field of expectations. A succession decision rewarded one network and diminished others. Most such tensions never became recorded conspiracies, and it would be wrong to assume that every royal family lived on the edge of assassination. In this case, however, one excluded branch seems to have concluded that the established order could still be overturned. That conclusion transforms the final years of the reign. The king who had defeated armies abroad was now surrounded by a quieter contest over what would follow him. T's faction did not need to challenge his monuments or deny his victories. It needed to survive his authority long enough to replace his chosen future with another one. Within the protected household, a royal mother and a prince whose original name would later be obscured became the center of that alternative. The papyrus preserves them only through accusation and punishment. It does not allow us to hear their defense, measure their confidence, or know whether they believed the gods favored their cause. What survives is the shape of a dynastic struggle. After defeat, one heir becomes Ramesses III, while the rival is stripped even of a secure name. Between those outcomes lies the moment when ambition required organization. The next step was to turn grievance into a functioning network, connecting the inner household to the people who could carry a secret across the palace walls. The conspiracy becomes visible not as a single meeting but as a chain of access. At its center stood T's faction, but the surviving judicial record names people from several levels of the royal establishment, officials of the harem, household servants, scribes, overseers, military men, and intermediaries able to reach beyond the palace. The plot's strength lay in this spread. No one conspirator needed to control the entire system. One person could carry a message, another could influence a guard, another could obtain ritual texts, and another could sound out support outside the royal household. Among the most prominent figures is a man usually called Pebekamen. His name, like several names in the papyrus, may have been rendered in a hostile form, and the record presents him through the language of guilt rather than biography. He appears as a key messenger and organizer, linking T's intentions to a wider group. The text associates him with communication between the women's quarters and people beyond them, making him less a dramatic mastermind than a crucial hinge. Conspiracies often depend on such figures, not the claimant, not the symbolic leader, but the person who knows whom to approach and how to move information without exposing the center. The papyrus does not preserve a complete list of everyone involved. Its beginning is missing, and the cases that survive are arranged according to the interests of the court that judged them. Some participants may never have been identified. Others may have been omitted, grouped together, or described only through titles. Women connected with the proceedings are often left unnamed, while male defendants are more frequently assigned individual identities, sometimes distorted ones. What remains is therefore a selected judicial map, not a transparent census of the conspiracy. Even so, the variety of offices is striking. A palace official could provide access. A scribe could copy instructions, manage records, or communicate in forms that appeared routine. A storehouse administrator might control materials and movement. A military officer could offer force or, just as importantly, persuade others not to resist. Servants knew private schedules and physical spaces. People connected to estates or workshops could carry messages outward under ordinary duties. The royal institution was built from specialized roles, and the plot seems to have exploited that specialization. The conspirators also appear to have sought influence beyond the immediate household. The judicial account refers to efforts to stir up people and create opposition outside the palace. The wording suggests a planned uprising, but its scale remains uncertain. It may have involved serious attempts to mobilize soldiers or civilians. It may also reflect the state's tendency to describe treason as a broad assault on order. The evidence remains incomplete, and no independent account records crowds rising for Tie's son. The planners understood murder alone would not secure succession. They needed confusion, delay, or active support while authority changed hands. That requirement made communication the plot's lifeblood. In a world without instant transmission, messages travelled through people, and people could betray, misunderstand, or enlarge what they carried. A spoken instruction might pass through several hands before reaching an officer. A written note could be concealed, intercepted, or copied. The more the network expanded, the greater its potential power and the greater the risk of exposure. Every new recruit created another point where loyalty could fail. The official record portrays the accused as knowingly joining evil, but real motives were probably uneven. Some may have believed Tie's son had a legitimate claim. Others may have expected promotion or protection under a new king. A few may have obeyed superiors without knowing the entire plan. Personal grievances, fear, family ties, and opportunism could all have played roles. The papyrus compresses those differences into guilt, because the court's purpose was not to explore rebellion's psychology. It was to classify threats and demonstrate that the state had overcome them. This is where the prince's obscured identity becomes especially significant. A claimant to the throne needed more than royal blood. He needed recognition. Those around him had to behave as if his kingship were possible. They had to risk their positions on the belief that the designated succession could be interrupted. Whether the prince actively directed them or served as the figure around whom others organized is not fully clear. The record condemns him, but it does not allow us to reconstruct every conversation between mother, son, and agents. Tie's role is similarly filtered. The text makes her central to the plan, yet it gives little sense of how she exercised influence. She may have issued instructions through trusted servants, used her household connections, and relied on officials whose careers were tied to her branch of the family. Her position within the harem gave proximity to royal life, but proximity alone did not create power. Power came from relationships who listened, who owed favors, who shared fears about the coming reign, and who could act without attracting attention. The network was therefore both larger and more fragile than a simple family plot. It crossed boundaries between domestic and administrative life, between ritual and military spheres, and between the palace and the outside population. Its members did not stand together in one room waiting for a signal. They occupied different places in the royal system, linked by messages and expectation. That dispersed form made the conspiracy difficult to see in advance. But once the government began investigating, it allowed guilt to spread by association. Some names in the record sound almost theatrical because they have reached us through punitive translation, hostile labels that turn individuals into embodiments of wrongdoing. This was part of the state's victory. To defeat a conspiracy was not enough. The defeated had to be rewritten as enemies of order. Their former names, offices, and loyalties could be stripped away, leaving only the moral categories assigned by the tribunal. The same process that preserved them for history also damaged their identities. Yet beneath that official language, a practical operation can still be detected. Messages moved. People were recruited. Guards were considered obstacles. Unrest beyond the palace was discussed. Ritual specialists or literate officials obtained texts and materials intended to weaken resistance. The conspiracy was not merely a wish that another prince might rule. It developed methods. Those methods reveal how the planners understood power. The king's body was protected by walls, soldiers, custom, and sacred status. To reach him, the conspirators sought to disrupt both human vigilance and invisible protection. They prepared not only political contacts but magical instruments, because in their world a coup could be fought through words, images, substances, and divine forces as well as through steel. The network that carried treason outward would soon carry something stranger: inward spells and wax figures designed to make the impossible approach to the Pharaoh seem possible. The conspirators did not rely on messages and political alliances alone. Somewhere within the royal establishment, people obtained magical texts, prepared images in wax, gathered ritual substances, and sought methods for weakening the guards who stood between them and the king. In ancient Egypt, however, magic was not automatically separate from religion, medicine, administration, or state power. It belonged to the accepted structure of reality. Words, images, names, gestures, and substances could act upon the world when used with the correct knowledge. The surviving records refer to rolls containing spells, figures of gods and human beings made from wax, and procedures intended to disable opponents or reduce their ability to resist. Some of this knowledge may have come from restricted collections connected with temples, palace institutions, or trained ritual specialists. The judicial text accused particular men of using writings taken from royal or sacred sources. Their offense was not that they believed in magic. Pharaohs, priests, healers, and households all used protective and curative rites. Their crime was directing such practices against the king and those charged with defending him. This distinction is essential. Egyptian magic, often described by the term Heka, was understood as a force built into creation. Protective amulets, spoken formulas, healing rituals, and funerary texts helped preserve health, repel danger, restore damaged bodies, and guide the dead. A spell could be written by a specialist, recited over an object, combined with medicine, or performed through symbolic action. The conspirators appear to have turned this legitimate ritual technology toward rebellion. Wax was especially useful because it could be shaped into a substitute for a person, deity, enemy, or protective being. What was done to the model could be understood as acting upon what it represented. A figure might be bound, pierced, melted, burned, buried, or inscribed with a name. Similar principles appear in protective rituals used by the state against foreign enemies and cosmic threats. In those settings, symbolic destruction defended Egypt. Within the conspiracy, comparable techniques were allegedly redirected against the guardians of royal order. The text suggests that the intended effects included weakening bodies, making limbs fail, confusing awareness, or allowing unauthorized people to pass through guarded spaces. They also mention substances or preparations used alongside ritual actions. It is difficult to determine whether these were ceremonial materials, medicinal compounds, sedatives, irritants, or something else. The record was written to condemn, not to provide a laboratory inventory. No surviving object can be tied securely to the attack, and no chemical evidence reveals what may have been administered. Scholars still debate how literally each accusation should be read. That uncertainty does not make the magical evidence unimportant. It reveals the conspirators' practical concerns. Guards were a problem. Restricted access was a problem. The sacred protection surrounding the Pharaoh was a problem. The plotters sought solutions in every category available to them. They recruited insiders, considered unrest outside the palace, and prepared rites intended to neutralize resistance. Magic did not replace planning, it accompanied it. The king's status made this especially significant. Ramesses III was not merely a political leader guarded because he controlled wealth and soldiers. In royal ideology, he was the living mediator between gods and humanity, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the ordered balance of the world. To attack him was to assault the sacred center of Egypt. Ritual preparation may have helped conspirators cross that psychological boundary. If the king possessed divine protection, then his enemies might believe they needed supernatural countermeasures before physical weapons could succeed. This does not mean that magic killed Ramesses III. The evidence from his body points to edged weapons and catastrophic physical trauma. A spell did not sever the trachea, cut the esophagus, damage major vessels, or remove part of the left great toe. The wax figures and magical roles belong to the preparation, confidence, and worldview of the conspiracy, not to the forensic mechanism of death. They may have been intended to incapacitate guards, protect attackers, curse opponents, or reassure participants that invisible forces had been brought to their side. There may also have been deception behind some rites. A person claiming access to powerful spells could gain influence over frightened conspirators. Ritual substances might have had ordinary physiological effects while being explained through sacred language. A preparation capable of causing sleep, confusion, or weakness would not cease to be understood as magical because it contained active ingredients. Egyptian healing texts often combine practical remedies with invocations. Modern categories separate pharmacology from ritual. Ancient practice could hold them together without contradiction. The official court treated these acts seriously. Possessing specialist knowledge created responsibility, and using royal texts against the royal person turned literacy itself into treason. Scribes and ritual experts were valuable because few people could read difficult compositions or reproduce the required formulas. Their participation suggests that the conspiracy reached individuals with access to controlled knowledge. Yet the judicial papyrus compresses complex practices into charges. It does not preserve the full wording of the spells or explain exactly how each object was used. Popular retellings sometimes make this part of the story sensational, imagining sorcerers moving through dark chambers while wax pharaohs melt over flames. Such scenes go beyond what survives. The precise appearance, timing, and setting of the rites remain unknown. There is no basis for claiming that a curse visibly overcame the guards, or that supernatural power opened the path to murder. What can be said is stranger in a more grounded way. Educated members of a royal society prepared magical operations as part of an actual political conspiracy. The same state that condemned those operations also depended upon magic. Ramesses III's temples, burial equipment, protective inscriptions, and funerary amulets drew upon the conviction that words and images could preserve order. After his death, embalmers would place the healing eye of Horus within his throat wound. The rebels used ritual knowledge to break royal protection. The burial specialists used ritual knowledge to restore the king after that protection failed. Magic stood on both sides because it was not inherently rebellious or loyal. Its moral meaning came from the purpose it served. That symmetry gives the conspiracy its deepest unease. The plotters were not outsiders rejecting Egyptian belief. They operated from within it, using the language of sacred power against the ruler who embodied sacred power. Their wax figures and spells reveal a palace in which treason had moved beyond private resentment into organized action. Yet ritual preparation still had to meet physical opportunity. Someone needed access to Ramesses III, Guards had to be distracted, compromised, weakened, or bypassed. Weapons had to come within reach. The spells may have promised that resistance would collapse, but the final passage from conspiracy to killing remains hidden, somewhere between the ordered world of the palace and the unknown hour when that order gave way. The passage from preparation to attack is where the evidence becomes most fragile. The conspiracy records tell us that plans existed, messages moved, guards were obstacles, and magical means were prepared. The mummy proves that Ramesses III suffered fatal violence. Between those bodies of evidence lies a scene no surviving source describes. There is no preserved account of the hour, the room, the king's activity, or the first movement of the assault. The final night can be reconstructed only as a frame built around absences. Medinet Habu offers the most powerful landscape for that reconstruction. Its walls, courts, gateways, storerooms, residences, and ritual spaces formed part of the royal world. By the end of Ramesses III's reign, the complex was more than a monument. It was a functioning center where ceremony, administration, security, and royal presence overlapped. Torches would have thrown uneven light across stone. Guards controlled gates and passages. Servants, priests, officials, and messengers moved according to schedules now mostly lost. In such a place, routine could become the conspirators' greatest advantage. A familiar theory connects the attack with the beautiful festival of the valley, when divine images crossed from the temples of the eastern bank toward the necropolis and mortuary temples in the west. The festival brought movement, visitors, offerings, music, food, and a change in the rhythm of sacred spaces. It is easy to imagine conspirators using that activity as cover, yet the judicial texts do not explicitly date the assassination to the festival. The Medinet Habu calendar helps historians understand ceremonies observed in the complex, but it does not identify the murder scene. The festival remains a proposed setting, not a recovered fact. The phrase "last night" must therefore be understood in the same cautious way. No ancient source says that Ramesses III was attacked after a banquet, while sleeping, or during the final evening of a celebration. He may have been attacked during daylight. He may have been moving between formal duties, resting in a protected area, or receiving people whose presence did not initially cause alarm. The evidence remains incomplete. Darkness belongs to the mystery and the modern reconstruction. It cannot be presented as a timestamp. Still, the conspiracy required opportunity. The attackers needed a moment when ordinary protection had become porous. Perhaps trusted insiders were on duty. Perhaps a message created a false summons. Perhaps guards were distracted, persuaded to withdraw, or affected by a substance. Perhaps the assault occurred in a passage where movement was restricted and escape difficult. Each possibility fits part of what is known, but none can be demonstrated. The surviving record provides functions and intentions rather than choreography. The king's own behavior is equally unknown. Ramesses III may have recognized danger before the fatal injury, or the attack may have begun without warning. He may have tried to stand, turn, flee, or call for assistance. Later, forensic evidence suggests violence affected more than one part of his body, but it cannot replay his movements. It cannot establish the sequence of injuries, the position of every attacker, or whether one blow followed another within seconds. A CT scan is a map of damage, not a recording of action. The palace environment also complicates the idea of a single assassination chamber. Royal complexes contained spaces with different degrees of access, and boundaries between temple, palace, and administrative areas were not always as simple as modern categories imply. The Eastern High Gate at Medinet Habu includes rooms decorated with royal women and ceremonial scenes, making it an evocative location for discussions of the harem. But our archaeology has not identified it as the place where Ramesses III was killed. To name it as the crime scene would turn atmosphere into evidence. What may be reconstructed more confidently is the collapse of protection. At least one assailant came within striking distance of the king. The conspiracy had reached enough people inside the establishment to make such proximity conceivable. The attack was not merely symbolic, because physical weapons were used. It was not entirely unsuccessful, because the king died. Yet the broader coup failed, because Tia's son did not secure the throne. Those facts define the boundaries of the event even when its interior remains dark. The speed of the political transition adds tension without clarifying the scene. Ramesses II's accession was counted from the 15th day of the 3rd month of Shemu. On the following day, officials informed the workmen at Deir el-Medina that Ramesses III had died. These records show that the machinery of succession was functioning quickly. They do not prove the exact day or hour of the assault, nor can they be converted into an unquestioned Gregorian date. Egyptian civil dates survive. Their placement within modern chronology depends on model scholars continue to refine. It is possible that the king died immediately or almost immediately after the fatal wound. It is also possible that a brief interval separated injury from death. What is not plausible is a long survival after such catastrophic trauma. Even so, the judicial papyrus places royal instructions at the beginning of its account, a feature that once encouraged the idea that Ramesses lived to order the trials. The document's present form was probably compiled or completed under Ramesses III, and its attribution of commands to the dead king may serve legal and ideological purposes. The voice of Ramesses III in the text is not proof that he dictated orders after the attack. This is how official memory can smooth a rupture. The king appears to authorize justice. The judges appear to act under proper command. The conspirators are separated into groups, condemned, and morally contained. The murder itself remains unstated. A successful killing becomes a failed rebellion, because the desired prince never rules and the established succession survives. The state cannot erase the death, but it can control the language surrounding it. The final hours should therefore feel uncertain rather than empty. Their power comes from the convergence of clues that stop just before becoming a scene. A royal complex provides geography but not a room. A festival provides possible commotion but not a date. Magical preparations reveal intent but not their effect. Administrative records narrow the transition but not the hour. The mummy confirms violence but cannot name the hands responsible. Somewhere within those limits, routine broke. A gate opened, a guard failed, a trusted person approached, or a protected route became exposed. The aging king who had spent decades staging victory encountered enemies from his own household network. We cannot hear the warning or recover the first blow. We can only follow what the body preserved. Beneath the reconstructed night, beyond the political language, one injury speaks with greater certainty than any papyrus a blade reached the throat of Ramesses III, and the kingdom's divine protector could not be protected from it. The body preserves the attack more clearly than the court record ever does. Beneath the linen collar, below the larynx, the scan reveals a deep injury crossing the front of the neck and driving inward toward the spine. Its path extends roughly 70 millimeters, reaching the cervical vertebrae around C5 to C7. The trachea is severed, the esophagus is cut, Major vessels in the region are damaged. Whatever uncertainty surrounds the room, hour or number of attackers, this wound leaves little doubt about its lethality. For a living person, such an injury would cause catastrophic bleeding and immediate collapse of breathing. Air would escape through the opened airway. Circulation to the brain would fail rapidly. The king could not have continued issuing commands, walking through the palace, or surviving for days as some earlier interpretations once allowed. The exact interval between injury and death cannot be measured from the mummy, but it would have been extremely short. Ramesses III almost certainly died at once or within moments. The wound sits lower than many popular depictions suggest. It is not a shallow slash across the upper throat, nor a neat ceremonial cut. The blade entered below the voice box and travelled through structures essential to life. CT imaging cannot identify the exact weapon, but the injury is consistent with a sharp-edged blade used with considerable force. Calling it a knife wound is reasonable in broad terms, yet even that may be too specific. A dagger, long knife, or another edged implement could have produced similar damage. Nor can the scan identify the assailant's position with certainty. The direction of the cut has encouraged reconstructions in which someone approached from behind or from the side. Other positions remain possible. The king could have been standing, kneeling, falling, restrained, or already weakened by another blow. Ancient tissues have shifted and dried, and the body was manipulated during embalming. Forensic interpretation can narrow possibilities, but it cannot restore the complete geometry of the attack. What survives in the record suggests an encounter at intimate distance. The attacker had to come close enough to place a blade against the king's neck and drive it inward. That closeness is more politically revealing than any imagined midnight scene. Ramesses III was surrounded by ritual prestige and human protection, yet someone penetrated both. A person stood within arm's reach of the ruler whose monuments show him towering beyond ordinary humanity. The embalmers confronted the damage directly. They filled the wound with linen and placed a wedge-at amulet inside it. The restored eye of Horus positioned where the king's body had been violently opened. In Egyptian myth, the injured eye of Horus is healed and made whole. The symbol carried ideas of restoration, protection, and recovered integrity. Placed in the throat, it became a ritual answer to the blade, where violence had broken the king. The amulet declared that wholeness could still be achieved beyond death. A thick collar of wrappings was then built around the neck. This may have stabilized the damaged area, recreated the body's proper outline, and concealed the wound from view. The bandaging was so effective that early examinations did not expose the cause of death. When the mummy was studied in the 19th century, investigators did not recognize the fatal injury hidden below the surface. Only non-invasive imaging allowed researchers to see through the layers without destroying the embalming work. That concealment raises an irresistible question. Were the embalmers ordered to hide evidence of regicide, or were they repairing a mutilated body according to funerary practice? The second explanation has direct support. Egyptian embalming repeatedly involved restoring missing or damaged parts so the deceased could enter the afterlife complete. The first remains possible as a political inference, but no surviving instruction tells the embalmers to suppress the truth. Ritual repair need not exclude discretion. They may have healed the body religiously while also avoiding public display of the king's vulnerability. The treatment shows that the embalmers knew the wound mattered. They did not treat it as accidental damage or ignore it beneath ordinary bandages. They concentrated linen, amulets, and careful reconstruction at the place where life had been cut away. The murderers created the injury, the embalmers created the form in which it would survive. For centuries, the judicial papyrus encouraged conflicting readings of the king's fate. Because the text describes trials and attributes instructions to Ramesses III, some historians wondered whether the conspiracy had been discovered before it could kill him, or whether he survived long enough to supervise justice. The CT evidence changed that discussion. It does not prove every accusation in the papyrus, but it shows that the ruler associated with the conspiracy died from a wound compatible with assassination. The state's refusal to state the murder plainly can no longer be taken as evidence that the killing failed. Still, the body does not turn the case into a solved crime. It cannot say whether the blade belonged to one of the named defendants. It cannot confirm that Tia ordered the fatal act, that the accused prince knew its timing, or that magic weakened the guards. It cannot identify whether the attack occurred during a festival or in the harem quarters. CT strongly supports violent death during the conspiracy, but it cannot verify every detail preserved by the victorious administration. There is also the problem of sequence. The neck wound is fatal enough to dominate the story, yet later, imaging revealed another major injury at the left foot. If both wounds occurred around the time of death, the throat may have been only one part of a coordinated assault. The king may have been attacked while upright and then struck again, or a disabling blow may have come first. The present evidence cannot decide. No surviving source records which injury came first or who delivered either blow. What the throat does establish is the finality of the attack. There is no plausible return from such damage, no long recovery concealed by official silence. Ramesses III did not merely face a conspiracy. His body confirms that violence reached its intended target. The blade cut through breath, speech, and blood, ending the life of the man whose office depended on command and whose monuments projected invulnerability. The state moved quickly to preserve continuity. The embalmers restored the body. The successor assumed the throne. The judicial record transformed a successful killing into a defeated rebellion. Yet the wound remained beneath the linen, beyond official language. 3,000 years later, it reappeared as a dark path through tissue, a physical contradiction to the polished image of orderly succession. And once the scanner exposed the throat, the next clue lay lower, hidden with equal care in a foot whose missing part suggested that the king may not have faced a single blade. The next injury was not visible when the mummy was first examined, and it remained hidden even after the wound in the throat had transformed the case. The left foot looked complete beneath its wrappings. Only a later CT study, focused closely on the king's feet, showed that part of the great toe had been cut away. The loss was not the result of decay, careless handling, or damage caused centuries after burial. The exposed edge of the bone remained sharp, with no sign that the body had begun to heal. The injury occurred at or very near the time of death. This second wound changes the assassination from a single fatal gesture into something more complicated. A throat cut can be imagined as one attacker reaching a vulnerable king. A severed toe suggests another angle, another movement, and possibly another weapon. The bone damage is consistent with a heavy object carrying a sharp edge, an axe-like implement being one plausible example. That does not mean a battle axe has been identified. No weapon survives with the secure connection to the body, and the scan cannot distinguish every possible edged tool. It reveals the effect, not the object that produced it. The left great toe helps stabilize the body during standing and movement. A forceful blow there could cause immediate pain, loss of balance, and collapse. It might have been intended to disable the king, prevent escape, or bring him within reach of another assailant. Yet this remains a reconstruction. The evidence cannot establish that the foot was struck first. The toe could have been injured during a struggle after the neck attack had begun, or both wounds might have been delivered within moments by different people. No single explanation fully accounts for the sequence. Royal imagery presents the pharaoh in complete command of his body, standing firm while enemies fall. The injured foot exposes the opposite reality. The ruler shown trampling enemies may himself have been destabilized by a blow to the foot, a stark reversal of the language carved across his monuments. The embalmers again responded with reconstruction rather than simple concealment. Where part of the toe was missing, they created a replacement from linen. The artificial section restored the outline of the foot so that the king entered burial with a complete body. Around the damaged area they placed 6 metallic wedge-at amulets, repeating the healing eye of Horus that had also been inserted into the throat wound. The concentration of protective objects shows that this was not routine wrapping. The embalmers recognized a severe injury and surrounded it with ritual protection. These 6 amulets are one of the case's lesser-known details. Their individual functions are not fully explained, but collectively they express protection and restoration. They transform the missing toe into a repaired part of the royal body. Metal, linen, image, and ritual knowledge supplied what violence had taken away. This treatment shows why the mummy could preserve evidence while appearing outwardly undamaged. Embalming altered the body, filled spaces, repositioned tissues, and added materials that could stabilize injuries and hide them from ordinary sight. 19th century investigators saw a carefully wrapped king. CT imaging sees the work beneath that surface, the original trauma, and the ancient response to it. The mummy is a layered object in which murder and repair occupy the same anatomy. The foot injury was reported in 2016, 4 years after the throat wound, and genetic findings had renewed attention to the conspiracy. It did not overturn the conclusion that the neck injury was fatal. Instead, it widened the possible attack. The king may have faced more than one assailant, or one person may have used more than one weapon. A sharp blade suitable for cutting the throat differs from the heavier-edged force implied by the toe. That contrast supports a multiple attacker scenario, but it does not prove one. Forensic caution matters because dramatic reconstructions can harden into false certainty. It is tempting to picture an axe striking first, the king falling, and a second conspirator cutting his throat. That sequence is coherent and cinematic. It is also unverified. The scan does not preserve the king's posture, the attacker's positions, or the number of seconds between the wounds. It cannot recreate the room. What survives in the record suggests coordination, but not choreography. Other possibilities remain. A single attacker might have struck the foot during a struggle and then used a different blade. 2 attackers might have approached from separate directions. The foot could have been injured as the king tried to evade the fatal blow, or as several people restrained him. The existence of a broad conspiracy makes group violence plausible. Yet a large network does not mean everyone named in the papyrus entered the assassination space. Most may have contributed through messages, access, ritual preparation, or political support rather than direct attack. The wound also complicates the image of effortless palace murder. Ramesses III may have resisted. He may have moved suddenly, forced attackers to adjust, or tried to escape. Nothing in the mummy allows a confident account of his final actions. But the distribution of trauma does not resemble a single controlled incision performed on an unmoving body. Violence reached both the neck and the foot, separated by most of the body's length. That pattern hints at movement and confusion while refusing to disclose their form. No evidence indicates that the toe was cut away by embalmers or removed long after death. The sharp margins and absence of healing support an injury around the time the king died, nor should it be said with certainty that the weapon was a war axe. The study identifies a heavy, sharp-edged instrument as compatible with the damage. Precision about what is unknown protects the significance of what is known. Together, the throat and foot wounds produce a more disturbing picture than either injury alone. The throat establishes the cause of death. The foot suggests that the attack may have involved an effort to disable, surround, or overwhelm the king. One wound was repaired with a linen collar and an eye of Horus placed inside the cut. The other was given a linen substitute and 6 protective eyes. In both places, embalmers rebuilt the body where violence had broken it. The palace record speaks of conspirators seeking to weaken guards through magic. The mummy shows a king physically weakened by weapons. Whether one assailant or several stood around him, the attack was close, forceful, and organized enough to overcome royal protection. The missing toe does not solve the murder, but it adds another attacker's shadow to the scene. From that shadow emerges the next problem, whether 2 distinct wounds made by apparently different kinds of force can tell us how many people took part in the killing. 2 injuries separated by the length of the body invite a simple conclusion: more than one person attacked Ramesses III. One assailant, perhaps armed with a heavy-edged weapon, strikes the left foot. Another, carrying a sharper blade, cuts the throat. The king falls between them, and the assassination is completed within seconds. It is the most vivid reconstruction of the murder, and it fits the existence of a wider conspiracy. But vividness is not proof. The CT scans reveal trauma. They do not count the hands that caused it. The contrast between the wounds remains important. The neck injury is deep and directed through soft tissue toward the cervical spine. The foot injury has the character of a powerful chopping blow, removing part of the great toe and leaving sharp bone margins. Different locations, directions, and probable mechanics make the use of 2 weapons plausible. A single person could have carried both, but changing weapons during an assault on a protected ruler would require opportunity. 2 or more attackers could act more quickly, especially if the goal was to prevent escape and guarantee death. One proposed sequence begins with the foot. A heavy blow lands low, destroying the toe and destabilizing the king. Ramesses loses his footing or drops toward the floor. While he is unable to move, another attacker approaches from the side or behind and drives a blade through his throat. This model explains why the injuries differ and why a conspiratorial group might have entered together. It also gives practical meaning to the plot's efforts to weaken guards and secure access. Yet there is no forensic marker proving that the foot wound came first. The fatal neck injury could precede it by seconds, and the lower blow could occur during the collapse or confusion that followed. Another reconstruction places the king in the middle of a struggle. One attacker reaches for his upper body while another blocks his path. Ramesses turns, attempts to move away, or is pushed against a confined space. A chopping weapon misses its intended target or strikes the foot deliberately. The throat is then cut in the disorder of restraint. Such a scene would account for injuries at opposite ends of the body, but it introduces details that no source preserves. There is no defensive wound securely identified on the hands, no surviving blood pattern, and no room whose architecture fixes the positions of the participants. Even the assumption of different weapons should remain qualified. CT images allow specialists to infer the type of force that damaged tissue and bone. But ancient metal blades varied in size, weight, and sharpness. A robust-edged weapon might conceivably produce both a chopping injury and a deep neck wound. One assailant could strike more than once. Conversely, several attackers might carry similar weapons. The body supports possibilities. It does not assign equipment to individuals. The judicial papyrus is equally unhelpful about the actual killing team. It names conspirators and describes roles in planning, communication, magic, and agitation, but it does not identify who held the blade. Its silence may be deliberate. Regicide was a dangerous fact to state openly, and the official narrative preferred to emphasize that rebellion had been discovered, judged, and defeated. By leaving the fatal moment vague, the new government could condemn a broad network without preserving a detailed account of royal vulnerability. The number of defendants therefore cannot be converted into the number of attackers. Dozens of people could support a coup while only one or two entered the king's presence. A messenger might be essential without witnessing the assault. A scribe might supply a text. A guard might withdraw from a doorway, and an officer might promise support after the succession. The conspiracy's scale shows organization, not the size of the group around Ramesses III when he was wounded. There is also a difference between assassination and coup. The killing succeeded in removing the reigning king, but the political operation failed to place T's son on the throne. This suggests either that the conspirators controlled the attack but not the institution surrounding succession, or that their plan was exposed before all of its parts could be completed. Ramesses IV's rapid accession indicates that the designated heirs faction retained command of administration, ritual recognition, and communication. The murder may have created panic inside the palace, without producing the wider collapse the planners required. Some scholars and popular accounts describe the event as a failed harem conspiracy because the intended claimant never ruled. Others call it a successful assassination followed by a failed coup. The second phrasing better reflects the mummy. Ramesses III was killed, but his chosen line survived. Whether the conspirators imagined a broader uprising, military intervention, or immediate proclamation of their prince remains uncertain. The references to stirring people outside the palace suggest ambitions beyond a private murder, though official language may enlarge the threat to justify severe punishment. A larger attack group would have carried risks. More people meant more noise, more chances for hesitation, and more witnesses who could later identify one another. A smaller team, supported by compromised insiders, might have been more effective. Guards could be neutralized beforehand, leaving only the final assailants to approach the king. The reported magical operations may have been intended to make this breach possible, either psychologically, ritually, or through substances whose effects cannot now be determined. What survives in the record suggests coordination without revealing command. Tia may have driven the succession plan, Pebekamen may have carried instructions, and specialists may have prepared magical means. But the person who decided how the king would be physically attacked remains unknown. The accused prince may have known every detail, or he may have waited for others to create the opening. The victorious court had little reason to preserve distinctions that could soften guilt. It grouped actions within a single moral category: rebellion against the Lord of Egypt. The two wounds therefore mark the boundary between evidence and reconstruction. They make a multiple attacker scenario reasonable. They do not establish the exact number of assailants, their positions, their weapons, or the order of the blows. The responsible account must hold both ideas at once. Ramesses III appears to have been overwhelmed in a violent, possibly coordinated assault, and the mechanics of that assault remain unresolved. Afterward, the attackers disappear from the physical scene, leaving the king's body to specialists of another kind. The embalmers encountered a throat open nearly to the spine and a foot missing part of its great toe. Their task was not to investigate. It was to reverse damage symbolically, restore shape, and prepare the murdered ruler for eternity. Whatever chaos surrounded his death, the body that entered the tomb had to present wholeness. The violence of one group would be answered by the reconstructive work of another. The violence ended with a body that could no longer be allowed to remain as it was. For the conspirators, Ramesses III's wounds were the means by which royal power might be transferred. For the embalmers, those same wounds were an emergency of another kind. A king could not enter eternity with his throat destroyed and part of his foot missing. The corpse had to be preserved, it had to be repaired, protected, and ritually transformed into a complete body capable of receiving life again. Egyptian embalming was not simply an attempt to stop decay. It was a process of reconstruction shaped by theology. The deceased was treated as one who might become like Osiris, the god restored after dismemberment. Limbs, organs, skin, wrappings, amulets, resins, and spoken rites worked together to create a body fit for rebirth. Damage threatened more than appearance. It threatened the integrity through which identity could continue. When the embalmers encountered the king's injuries, their task was therefore both practical and sacred. At the neck, they faced catastrophic destruction. The cut had opened the airway and esophagus, damaged major vessels, and penetrated toward the spine. Soft tissues had been separated in a region essential to breath and speech. The embalmers packed and supported the area with linen, then wrapped the neck in a thick collar that restored its external form. Within the wound they placed the Wedjat amulet, the healed eye of Horus, turning the site of murder into a location of protection. The blade had broken the king's body. The ritual response declared that brokenness could be reversed. The same principle guided the treatment of the left foot. Part of the great toe had been removed by a sharp, forceful blow around the time of death. Rather than leave the foot incomplete, the embalmers fashioned a substitute from linen. It was not a functional prosthesis intended for a living man. It was a funerary reconstruction, restoring the shape required for the king's eternal movement. Around the damaged area they placed 6 metallic Wedjat amulets, concentrating symbols of healing where the body had been most visibly diminished. These repairs were hidden beneath outer wrappings so carefully that the injuries escaped ordinary inspection. When the mummy was unwrapped and studied in 1886, investigators did not identify the fatal throat wound. The body had been recovered 5 years earlier from the royal cache at Deir el-Bahri, not from Ramesses III's tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Ancient priests had moved it with other royal mummies to protect them from robbery. By the time modern researchers examined the king, the embalmer's work had already concealed the physical history of his death for more than 3 millennia. That concealment has encouraged the idea of a deliberate cover-up. Perhaps the court feared that visible evidence of regicide would weaken the new reign. Perhaps the embalmers were instructed to hide the attack so that Ramesses IV could present an orderly succession. Such possibilities cannot be excluded, but they remain inference. The strongest evidence shows that the embalmers repaired injuries according to established religious logic. Thick wrappings, substitute body parts, and protective amulets belong to a wider Egyptian concern with bodily wholeness. Political secrecy may have overlapped with ritual restoration, but no surviving document gives an order to erase the murder from the corpse. The distinction matters because the mummy was not prepared for modern investigators. The embalmers were not preserving a crime scene. They altered it deliberately, adding materials, repositioning tissue, and shaping the body according to funerary requirements. Forensic specialists must therefore read two events at once: the original violence and the ancient treatment that followed. A linen filling may mark where tissue was lost. An amulet may identify a wound the embalmers considered dangerous. A reconstructed toe may reveal both the severity of trauma and the religious refusal to let that trauma define the dead king. Their work also created a strange balance between revelation and silence. The outer body did not announce assassination, yet the placement of amulets acknowledged the injuries with remarkable precision. The wedget in the throat was not randomly positioned. The 6 eyes around the foot were not distributed as ordinary decoration. The repairs concealed the wounds from casual view while preserving their locations for anyone able to see beneath the layers. In this sense, the embalmers hid the violence and recorded it at the same time. There may have been urgency. A royal burial required complex preparations, and the death of a pharaoh immediately activated rituals, administrative decisions, and work on the tomb. Ramesses III's body had to be processed while Ramesses IV consolidated authority and the government investigated treason. Embalmers, priests, officials, and craftsmen operated within the same political transition, though their exact knowledge of the conspiracy is unknown. Some may have known the king had been murdered. Others may have been told only that the body was damaged and must be restored. The throat wound would have been impossible for the chief embalmers to misunderstand. They saw what later generations could not: a deep opening made while the king was alive or at the point of death. They cleaned, packed, and wrapped it. They handled the missing toe and created its replacement. Their silence was professional, ritual, and perhaps political. No embalming report survives to describe what they witnessed. The body itself became their report, written in linen, resin, metal, and placement. This work complicates the idea that ancient Egypt tried merely to suppress failure. The king's mortuary treatment did not deny that he had been wounded. It answered the wounds through theology. The state could avoid saying plainly that Ramesses III was killed, but funerary ritual could confront the damage without naming its cause. The murdered body became whole enough for burial even while the political record turned murder into an episode of defeated rebellion. The result is one of the most powerful intersections of belief and forensic evidence from the ancient world. Modern scanning reveals the injuries, but it also reveals how ancient specialists understood them. The amulets are not decorations added beside the evidence. They are part of the historical response to the crime. They show that those who prepared Ramesses III recognized specific points of destruction and acted to neutralize their consequences in eternity. By the time the wrappings were complete, the king's throat again had a continuous outline. His foot again appeared whole, and the signs of attack had disappeared beneath ritual order. The body was ready to enter the tomb, but the political world outside could not be repaired in the same way. Ramesses III was dead. The rival prince had not secured the crown. Ramesses IV had already become king, and the machinery of government was moving to announce that fact. The embalmers could restore the corpse, but only the successor could restore authority. Authority did not wait for the embalming to end. While specialists rebuilt the dead king beneath linen, officials were already dating the world to a new reign. Ramesses IV's accession was counted from the 15th day of the 3rd month of Shemu. On the following day, an official named Montumes informed the workmen of Deir el-Medina that Ramesses III had died and that his successor now ruled. The message is brief and severe in its restraint. It does not describe a murder. It does not mention Tiye, the rival prince, or the confusion that may have followed the attack. It records the fact that mattered to the functioning state one king was dead and another had taken his place. The sequence is among the clearest surviving points in an uncertain chronology. Ramesses III's reign begins on 3 Shemu 15. News of his father's death reaches the royal tomb workers on 3 Shemu 16. These dates belong to the Egyptian civil calendar, and converting them into an exact modern date depends on chronological models scholars still debate. They should not be transformed into an unquestioned night and hour for the assassination. Ramesses III may have died shortly before the accession date, on it, or near the administrative transition. The documents narrow the passage of power without revealing the instant of violence. At Deir el-Medina, the announcement interrupted work. The settlement's craftsmen were not ordinary labourers. They cut and decorated royal tombs, maintained close connections with the necropolis administration, and recorded daily events with unusual care. When the death was announced, normal activity ceased and ritual responses followed. Their reaction shows how the king's death moved outward from the palace into other institutions. A ruler's passing was a state event. Tomb work, rations, ceremonies, commands, and dating formulas all had to adjust. The speed of that adjustment is politically decisive. Tiye's faction had intended to place her son on the throne, yet the administrative record recognizes Ramesses IV. Whatever happened during the attack, the conspirators failed to control the channels that converted royal blood into recognized kingship. They may have killed the pharaoh, but they did not secure the succession. The crown prince's supporters retained enough authority to proclaim him, communicate his accession, and begin governing before the rival branch could establish an alternative. This explains why the episode can be called both a successful assassination and a failed coup. The murder removed Ramesses III. The political project attached to it did not achieve its principal aim. A coup requires more than access to a ruler's body. It requires control over officials, troops, temples, records, treasuries, and communication. A claimant must be named as king, accepted in ritual, and obeyed across Egypt. Tiye's network was broad enough to endanger the dynasty, but not broad enough to replace it. The conspirators may have expected the king's death to produce a pause in which their prince could be declared. Perhaps they believed unrest beyond the palace would paralyze the designated heir's faction. Perhaps sympathetic soldiers were expected to intervene. Perhaps magical preparations were intended to ensure that guards and officials could not resist. The surviving evidence does not show how far these plans progressed. No independent record describes a proclamation for Tiye's son, and no monument dates a reign to him. If he was briefly presented as ruler within a confined group, the state erased the moment so completely that it cannot now be demonstrated. Ramesses IV, by contrast, appears with the advantages of preparation. He had been designated as successor, and the transition suggests that men responsible for administration, burial, and communication recognized his claim immediately. His accession did not mean the palace was calm. Investigations, arrests, and judicial proceedings still lay ahead. Yet the most dangerous interval had been crossed. Once records carried the new king's regnal year and institutions acted in his name, every delay made the rival claim weaker. The burial of Ramesses III also served the successor. A proper royal funeral affirmed that the old king had entered divine eternity, and that the new king now performed the duties of legitimate heir. In Egyptian ideology, The living pharaohs could be associated with Horus, while the dead ruler became Osiris. The son's role in restoring and burying his father was therefore not only familial, it was a public demonstration that cosmic and dynastic order continued. The murdered body, repaired by embalmers, became part of the stabilization of Ramesses IV's reign. The Great Harris Papyrus would later enlarge this image of continuity. It praised Ramesses III's victories, temple gifts, and benefactions while presenting the successor as inheritor of a magnificent reign. It did not narrate the attack or acknowledge that the transition unfolded under the shadow of treason. This silence was useful. The new reign did not need the king's final memory to be a scene of helplessness. It needed him to appear as a completed ruler whose achievements passed lawfully to his son. Yet the administrative documents from Deir el-Medina preserve a colder truth beneath that polished memory. Their abrupt change of reign shows how quickly death became procedure. A messenger arrives. Work stops. A new royal name governs time. The machinery of Egypt absorbs the disappearance of the man at its center and continues. That continuity was the conspirators' defeat. No source tells us exactly when they realized the throne had escaped them. It may have been almost immediate, as loyal officials secured the crown prince. Some plotters may have fled, while others concealed their roles. Messages and magical objects that once seemed instruments of a coming reign became evidence of treason. A guard who had expected reward could now face interrogation. A scribe who copied a spell could be traced through associates. The same network that had carried the conspiracy outward could be followed backward by investigators. The new government had powerful reasons to act. It needed to identify those who had breached royal security, prevent renewed support for the rival prince, and demonstrate that rebellion had not shaken divine order. At the same time, it had to avoid exposing too much about the king's vulnerability. The solution was a controlled judicial narrative the criminals had committed great offences. The lawful king's authority endured, and punishment restored balance. Thus, the day after the recorded accession is not merely a chronological marker, it reveals the central paradox of the affair. Ramesses III was dead, perhaps within moments of the wounds now visible on his mummy. The conspiracy had crossed the final barrier and achieved what royal propaganda could scarcely admit. Yet Egypt did not become the kingdom of Tiye's son. Ramesses IV's name entered the records, the workmen received the news, the burial proceeded, and the state turned toward judgment. The assassins had broken the body of the king, but they failed to seize the system that survived him. The state that survived the assassination now had to convert danger into judgment. The conspirators had failed to place Tiye's son on the throne, but failure did not make them harmless. Their network had reached into the royal household, crossed administrative offices, touched the military, and apparently drawn upon ritual specialists with access to restricted texts. Ramesses IV's government therefore faced two tasks: discover how far the plot had spread, and present the outcome as proof that order had been restored. The surviving judicial record divides the accused into groups and describes the proceedings in formal, selective language. It is not a modern transcript, and it does not preserve every question, answer, or piece of evidence. Names appear beside offices, accusations, and punishments, often with hostile wording that reduces individuals to moral examples. The court classifies the defendants as enemies of the king. A modern analysis of the surviving material counts 31 named men and 6 unnamed wives, producing 37 defendants. The punishments are not uniform. Roughly 22 cases appear to end in execution. Around 11 involve suicide or compelled suicide. 4 defendants suffer mutilation of the nose and ears. 1 receives only a reprimand. 1 man is mutilated and then takes his own life, which is why the same analysis identifies 38 punishment entries for 37 people. These totals are reconstructions from formulaic ancient wording, not figures copied from a tabulated verdict sheet. The variation matters. The court distinguished between degrees of guilt, status, and participation, even if the basis for every distinction is lost. Those judged central to the conspiracy could be condemned to death. Certain elite defendants, including the accused prince, appear to have been allowed or ordered to take their own lives. This may have preserved some distance between royal authority and the execution of royal or high-status persons. It also allowed the record to present death as the consequence of judgment without describing the method in detail. The prince commonly called Pentawere belongs to this category. The papyrus states that he was brought before the judges, found guilty, and left in the place where he was, after which he took his own life. The wording is indirect. It does not describe a rope, poison, blade. It does not prove that unknown man E is the same person, and it does not establish how the condemned prince died. The emphasis falls not on his suffering, but on the completion of judgment. Names themselves become instruments of punishment. Several defendants are preserved under forms that may carry hostile or degrading meanings. The prince had previously borne another name, but the court record does not securely preserve it. To replace or distort a name could sever the condemned from honourable memory. In a culture where the spoken and written name helped sustain identity after death, such treatment had consequences beyond bureaucratic labelling. The state did not merely punish bodies, it reshaped how traitors would be remembered. Yet the record is not consistent enough to turn every unusual name into a deliberate curse. Scribal conventions, translation difficulties, and damaged passages complicate interpretation. Scholars still debate the meaning of several names and whether all were intentionally altered. The safest conclusion is that hostile naming formed part of the judicial language, while the original identities of certain defendants remain uncertain. Mutilation served a different purpose. Cutting the nose and ears mark the body publicly and permanently. Such punishment could expose disgrace, remove social standing, and make betrayal visible. It was especially significant in a society that valued bodily completeness in life and for the afterlife. The record does not dwell on the physical process. Its political meaning is clear enough the offender would carry the verdict on the face. The proceedings also turned inward upon the judges themselves. Some members of the tribunal were accused of improper contact with women connected to the case. The account suggests that judges and officials joined a social gathering involving these women when they should have maintained strict separation. Popular retellings sometimes describe a deliberate seduction operation, but the evidence does not prove such a scheme. It records compromised conduct, not a complete account of sexual manipulation. This breach was serious because the tribunal's authority depended on distance from the accused. A judge who socialized with people connected to the conspiracy risked appearing corrupt, influenced, or disloyal. Several officials were punished, including men who suffered mutilation. One later took his own life. Another appears to have escaped with a reprimand. The scandal demonstrates that the investigation did not unfold as a perfectly controlled exercise. Even the machinery created to judge the conspiracy became vulnerable to misconduct. The court's composition and procedure remain only partly understood. Ramesses III is presented as authorizing selected officials to investigate and judge without consulting him. Since the surviving document was probably compiled or completed under Ramesses IV, this royal voice should not be read as proof that the murdered king personally supervised the trials. It provided legitimacy. The judges acted as if under the dead king's command, allowing the new government to punish his enemies while presenting continuity between the reigns. The indirect language around execution served the same purpose. Egyptian official texts often avoided blunt descriptions when speaking of royal scandal or elite punishment. Defendants are sometimes said to have been dealt with, to have died by their own hands, or to have received the penalty their crimes deserved. Such formulas create distance between the court and the violence of judgment. They also prevent the condemned from dominating the narrative. T's own fate remains conspicuously unclear. She is central to the accusation, yet the surviving record does not state her final punishment. Claims that she was burned alive or subjected to a spectacular death go beyond the evidence. The silence may result from missing portions, selective composition, or political caution. It leaves one of the conspiracy's principal figures suspended between certainty of accusation and uncertainty of outcome. This uncertainty runs through the trial record. We know that severe punishments followed, but not every procedural step. We know that some defendants were compelled to die, but not precisely how. We know that judges were compromised, but not the full character of their misconduct. We know that names were altered or hostile, but not always why. The tribunal restored authority by producing verdicts, yet the text preserving those verdicts remained selective and political. By the end of the proceedings, the defeated faction had been reduced to criminals, mutilated officials, unnamed women, and a prince stripped of a secure identity. Ramesses IV's government could present the conspiracy as contained, but containment required more than punishment. It required control over memory. The papyrus that preserves the case was designed not simply to tell what happened, but to determine how the crime, the criminals, and the dead king would be understood. The tribunal's punishments mattered, but the document that preserves them matters just as much. The judicial papyrus of Turin is often treated as though it were a courtroom transcript, a direct window into words spoken by judges, defendants, and witnesses. It is nothing of the kind. It is a carefully composed official summary, written after the proceedings had been organized into a form useful to the victorious government. Its language records guilt, procedure, and punishment, but not the full exchange of questions and answers. What survives is not the sound of the courtroom. It is the state's edited memory of it. The papyrus itself reinforces that impression. More than 5 meters long, it carries 6 columns of formal writing across the recto, while the verso remains blank. The material is of good quality, and the script belongs to a controlled scribal tradition, rather than hurried note-taking. Its physical form suggests a document intended for preservation and authority. This was not a scrap filled during an interrogation. It was produced as an official object whose arrangement and wording helped define what the conspiracy had meant. Recent study of the Turin papyri has sharpened attention to such material details. The texture of the papyrus, preparation of the writing surface, distribution of text, and scribal habits help explain how administrative documents were produced and stored. These features do not reveal the murderer, but they change how the record should be read. A polished document created within a bureaucratic archive has different purposes from a witness statement. It selects, it regularizes. It turns disorder into categories the state can manage. That process is visible in the way defendants are grouped. Individuals appear according to judicial episodes, roles, and penalties rather than in a simple chronological account. The papyrus does not begin with Tyre deciding to act, then follow every message until the king is attacked. Instead, it presents a sequence of cases. The structure resembles a legal and political summary assembled after investigation, not a narrative written while events unfolded. Missing portions make the sequence harder to reconstruct, and scholars still debate how completely the surviving text represents the original proceedings. The official voice also avoids the central fact. It condemns treason against the ruler and describes those who plotted rebellion, yet never plainly states that Ramesses III's throat was cut and that the attack killed him. Modern CT supplies that physical certainty. The papyrus circles around it. This silence is unlikely to be accidental. To write openly that conspirators reached the divine king and destroyed his body would preserve royal failure alongside their guilt. The new government needed to punish the crime without allowing it to define the monarchy. Instead, the document emphasizes that justice operated under royal authority. Its opening places instructions in the voice of Ramesses III, commanding chosen officials to investigate and judge. Read literally. This once encouraged the belief that the king survived and personally arranged the trials, but the fatal wound makes prolonged survival almost impossible, and the surviving document was probably compiled or completed under Ramesses IV. The dead king's voice functions less like recorded dictation than a source of legal legitimacy. The judges act in his name because the new reign presents itself as continuing his order. This does not mean every statement in the papyrus is invented. Official documents can be politically shaped and still preserve genuine events. The conspiracy is strongly supported by the range and specificity of charges, while the king's body independently confirms lethal violence. The names, offices, magical preparations, and punishments likely reflect real investigations. Yet the text cannot be treated as neutral simply because some claims align with forensic evidence. Agreement on murder does not verify every accusation, motive, or defendant's degree of knowledge. The language used for the accused shows how memory was controlled. Some names appear in forms that may be deliberately hostile, reducing people to identities associated with evil or disgrace. The condemned prince is known by a name the papyrus implies was not his original one. Such choices could weaken a traitor's place in collective memory, especially where preservation of the name supported continued existence. A person could be executed physically and then diminished textually. Still, caution is required. Not every strange name is certainly a judicial invention, and translation can exaggerate meanings that were more ambiguous in Egyptian, damage, scribal convention, and later interpretation complicate the picture. What can be said is that the document presents its subject through the moral vocabulary of the state. It does not preserve them as complex individuals. It records them as offenders against the king and order. The papyrus also tells us almost nothing from the conspirator's perspective. Tyre does not explain why she believed her son should rule. The prince does not defend his claim. Perbecamen does not describe how he understood the messages he carried. The guards, scribes, and officers do not speak in full voices. Their motives are compressed into formulas of disloyalty. Some may have acted from ambition, fear, kinship, or obedience, but the official account has little interest in those distinctions unless they affected sentencing. The same selectivity shapes the treatment of judges who compromise themselves. Their misconduct is recorded because punishing them demonstrates the government's vigilance, yet details remain sparse. The text tells enough to establish guilt, not enough to reconstruct the gathering or understand every relationship involved. It is judicial in function and ideological in tone. Seen this way, the papyrus is not merely a source about the conspiracy, it is part of the aftermath. Like the embalmer's wrappings, it repairs damage. The linen restores the king's body. The legal text restores the state's image. One covers wounds with ritual wholeness. The other covers political rupture with procedure, verdict, and continuity. Both acknowledge injury indirectly, while refusing to let destruction have the final word. That comparison explains why the document remains so valuable. Its silences are evidence. Its organization reveals what the government considered dangerous. Its naming practices show how punishment extended into memory. Its invocation of Ramesses III shows how the dead king's authority could be used by his successor. The papyrus does not replay the assassination, but it preserves the struggle to control what the assassination would mean. By the time the text took its surviving form, Ramesses IV was king, the principal defendants had been judged, and the rival succession had failed. The state could present the affair as a contained deviation from order. Yet one figure still resisted that containment, a young man, buried under unusual conditions and later found among royal mummies, carried the genetic signature of a son of Ramesses III. He would become known only as Unknown Man-E, and his body would reopen the question of whether the prince erased from the papyrus had survived in another kind of record. The final figure in the conspiracy does not appear first in a papyrus, but in a body without a secure name. In 1881, when royal mummies were recovered from the hidden cache at Deir el-Bahri, one young man stood apart from the kings and queens around him. He would later be called Unknown Man-E. His burial treatment was unusual. His face seemed fixed in tension, and his identity had been stripped away. For more than a century, he became a vessel for speculation, a disgraced prince, a murdered foreigner, a victim of punishment, perhaps even the condemned son at the center of the Harem conspiracy. The body appears to belong to a young man who died around 18 to 20 years of age. Unlike carefully prepared royal mummies, his internal organs and brain were not treated in the standard elite manner. His skin has a reddish appearance, and he was wrapped in a goatskin, a material sometimes associated with impurity or unfavorable symbolism in Egyptian contexts. These details have often been interpreted as signs of deliberate dishonor. Yet funerary practice was not perfectly uniform. Preservation can alter appearance, and the exact meaning of every treatment remains uncertain. An unusual burial is evidence of difference, not a complete biography. His expression has encouraged some of the most dramatic claims. The mouth is open, the features contracted, and folds around the neck have been read as evidence of hanging or strangulation. Other theories propose poison, suffocation, burial while alive, or forced suicide. None has been proven by decisive forensic evidence. A face changed by death, desiccation, and embalming cannot be treated like a photograph of the final moment. The cause of death of Unknown Man-E remains undetermined. The strongest link to the royal family came from genetic analysis published alongside the CT investigation of Ramesses III in 2012. The two mummies shared the same YSTR profile, and the autosomal evidence strongly supported a father and son relationship. This made Unknown Man-E a biological son of Ramesses III, or at least a person genetically compatible with that relationship under the tested markers, because the king had several sons. The result could not identify which son lay inside the strange wrappings. DNA narrowed the field dramatically, but it did not write the name Pentaware upon the body. Even so, the convergence is difficult to ignore. The judicial papyrus describes a royal son who joined the conspiracy, was judged, and then took his own life, or was compelled to do so. Unknown man, E was a young male related paternally to Ramesses III, and buried under conditions unlike those of an honoured prince. The age, genetics, and unusual preparation make him a persuasive candidate for the condemned claimant. Scholars and popular histories often connect the two. The responsible conclusion is narrower: he may be Pentaware, but the identification has not been proven beyond doubt. There is no inscription naming him, no tomb equipment provides a title, no surviving tag from the royal cache securely connects him with Tiye. The papyrus itself says that the accused prince had once borne another name, which further complicates comparison. If the state deliberately erased or replaced his identity, the absence of a name on the mummy might fit the punishment. It might also result from later displacement, lost burial equipment, or circumstances unrelated to the conspiracy. What seems meaningful is not always unique. Unknown man, he therefore stands at the boundary between historical person and forensic possibility. He may preserve the body of the rival heir whose faction reached the king but failed to seize Egypt. If so, father and son eventually came to rest in the same royal cache, one with his throat reconstructed and his foot repaired, the other without a name and with a burial that appeared to deny ordinary honour. Their bodies would then record opposite sides of the same failed revolution. Yet this remains an interpretation built from separate clues, not a final identification. Ramesses III's own afterlife was far more controlled. His intended tomb, KV11 in the Valley of the Kings, was a vast royal monument with corridors, chambers, painted texts, and images designed to carry him safely through the underworld. His mummy did not remain there. Ancient priests transferred it to the Deir el-Bahri cache with other royal dead, probably to protect it from robbery. When discovered in 1881 and examined in 1886, it seemed to preserve another dead ruler whose exact cause of death had vanished. Only modern imaging exposed the wounds that the tomb and official memory had concealed. The contrast between the two bodies mirrors the contrast between the surviving documents. The judicial papyrus of Turin remembers rebellion through accusation and punishment. The Great Harris papyrus remembers the reign through victory, generosity, and legitimacy, completed under Ramesses III. The Great Harris papyrus praises his father's military successes and immense gifts to temples. It presents a ruler who restored Egypt, enriched the gods, and handed a stable kingdom to his lawful successor. It does not mention the assassination. That silence was politically useful. Ramesses IV needed a dead father who remained triumphant, not a victim whose household had broken around him. The Great Harris papyrus turned a violent transition into dynastic continuity. The judicial text isolated the conspirators as criminals. The funerary rites restored the king's body. Together, these acts transformed catastrophe into order. They could not undo the killing, but they could decide which parts of it would be visible. Modern science has reversed some of that work without destroying it. CT imaging exposed the throat wound and the severed toe. DNA linked an unnamed young man to the king. Material study revealed how carefully the judicial papyrus was produced. None of these discoveries has solved every question. The attackers remain unidentified. Their number is unknown. The time and place of the assault are uncertain. Tiye's punishment is missing. Pentaware's original name is lost, unknown. Man, his cause of death remains unresolved. Later scholarship has refined the documents more than the diagnosis. Studies of papyrus manufacture and scribal practice clarify how Turin records were assembled, while books and public discussions revisit the case. No newer forensic examination has displaced the central findings: lethal neck trauma, a perimortem foot injury, and a probable father-son genetic relationship. The case endures because each source answers a different question and refuses the next. The papyrus proves conspiracy but obscures the murder. The mummy proves murder but cannot name the killers. DNA suggests a royal son but cannot recover his identity. Propaganda preserves the dynasty while erasing the violence that tested it. What survives in the record suggests not one mystery, but a collision between body, text, ritual, and power. More than 3,000 years later, the palace is gone quiet. The guards, servants, judges, embalmers, and messengers have disappeared, along with the rooms in which they made their choices. Even the names they tried to preserve have fractured. A king remains because linen held his body together. A condemned prince may remain because someone, despite disgrace, still wrapped him and placed him among the dead. Time does not preserve history evenly. It keeps a wound and loses the hand that made it. It saves a verdict but not the accused person's voice. It carries forward a monument's certainty while allowing the fear behind it to vanish. The closer we come to Ramesses III's final hours, the more clearly we see the limits of recovery. Science can enter beneath bandages, trace bloodlines, and map injuries, but it cannot return intention to a silent face. Perhaps that is why the story remains so powerful. It is not simply the account of a murdered pharaoh or a failed claimant. It is a reminder that even the most carefully managed memory can be disturbed by what bodies retain. Kingdoms write victories, families hide disgrace, priests repair what violence breaks, yet somewhere beneath the words and wrappings, fragments continue to wait. There is humility in that final uncertainty. The past does not owe the present a complete confession. Sometimes it offers only enough to overturn an old certainty, then closes again. Ramesses III was once remembered mainly through victories carved in stone. Now his damaged body speaks beside them, quietly insisting that power, however sacred it appears, is still carried by mortal flesh and remains vulnerable to the people nearest it in silence. Ramesses III once covered temple walls with images of enemies collapsing before him. In death, others covered his own injuries with healing eyes. The symbols did not erase the attack. They carried him beyond it, into the long darkness where history and belief become almost impossible to separate. And so the last image is not of the blade, the tribunal, or the throne. It is of the royal cache in silence, father and possible son resting among displaced kings, their identities protected and damaged by time. One bears a hidden wound, the other bears a hidden name. Around them, the ancient world recedes, leaving only linen, bone, ink, and the faint outline of a night that no record can fully restore.